and welcome to this week's installment of Ask an Attorney on Facebook Live. Dwayna Boswell O'Shell here with the Boswell Law Firm, and one of our big mottos is, we want to prevent, we're providing peace in the chaos. It's a new tagline I'm working on, so bear with me a little bit. So one question I get asked a whole lot is, how do I keep my property during a divorce? And the answer to that is it depends on how that property is what we call characterized. So property is characterized as either separate or community property. And in Texas, since we're a community property state, it is decided that each spouse has an equal interest in any property that's acquired during the marriage. And the presumption is on the date of divorce, everything that is owned by or possessed by either party is community property. Now, there's ways to prove that, in fact, that's not true, that there are separate property assets in the divorce. And separate property is anything that you owned prior to marriage, and it's anything that you get during the marriage, either by somebody giving you a gift or by somebody dying and leaving it to you, either through a will or through the laws of intestacy. So the state of Texas says who gets what when somebody dies without a will. So there's some different ways to prove. Like I said, there's a community property presumption, so the court's going to automatically presume everything that's in the possession of either spouse is community property. And so it is then on the spouse that is saying that a piece of property is separate to prove to the court that it's separate property. So what does that really mean? So when we're trying to prove to the court that a piece of property is not community and separate, we are rebutting the presumption, is what we call it. And that just mainly means that we have to introduce evidence to show that the property is not community but separate. And there's a couple ways that you can rebut the presumption. One is by a contractual agreement of the parties. Easy enough. Both of you agree, either in a prenup agreement, or you can have an agreement during marriage, or an agreement incident to divorce, a mediated settlement agreement, any kind of agreement where the parties agree that a piece of property is the separate property of one of the spouses. The other way, when there isn't an agreement, is called the inception of title. And the inception of title basically says that a property's character as community or separate is based on the time and manner in which a person first acquires an ownership interest in the property. So if the property is acquired during the marriage, you need to take another step and prove how that property was obtained. Was it somebody gave you a gift? Was it by somebody leaving it to you as an inheritance? So those are a couple ways to prove through inception of title. So how does inception of title actually work? What are we looking at? So it is important to note that once a property's character is established as either separate or community, it will not change. And that's important because we can have mutations of property, which, we have, sometimes we have a separate property inheritance of cash, and we use that cash to buy a house during the marriage. That house, if purchased solely with the separate property funds, remains separate property. And there's some methods that we can use called tracing. I won't get into tracing too much here because it's a lot more complicated, but I can talk about that in a future installment. So how do we use, as an attorney, to do an inception of title analysis? So step one is we're going to determine the date the property was first acquired. Step two, we then look and see what is the marital status on that date. An important note here is Texas doesn't recognize legal separation. So that means that even though you guys are separated, any property that you acquire during that separation period is still community property. Sorry, I have a dog hair on my nose. Um, and then step 3, you're going to determine the manner of acquisition. How did you get it? And you want to look and see, did we get a gift? If it was during marriage, did we get the property through devise or descent? So devise would be somebody leaving it to you in a will. Descent is what we call it when there's not a will and the state law controls. Is there an agreement on how that property was going to be treated between the parties? Did you have a personal injury lawsuit from a car accident or some other accident? Proceeds recovered from personal injury are separate property depending on what that recovery was from. It makes a difference on, was it for injuries you sustained or was it from lost wages? So there's some things that in personal injury can be community property and some that are separate. And so once again, another subject for another day. Then you also want to look and see if something was purchased with cash. You want to be able to show where the cash came from. It's going to be presumed that any cash that's spent on an asset came from community funds. So it's going to be up to you to prove to the court that it actually came from separate property funds. Same for anything purchased on credit. You've got to show that it was purchased on a separate credit of a spouse. Otherwise, it's going to be presumed to be community credit. So there's a few things that are interesting on how a property's character is, or when they say that the inception of title is on some common property. One, a bank account. Obviously, the open date of a bank account is going to be very important, but one thing to know is you can have a separate property bank account. However, any interest that is earned on that bank account during marriage is community property. And so you have to look at the date that the interest was earned to see whether the interest is actually community or separate property. If you have a business or a corporation, it's going to be the date that you filed the letters of incorporation. Insurance policies is going to be the date of when that insurance policy was issued. Insurance proceeds, if it renewed, the date renewed policy was originally issued is what you're going to look at. So just because it renews during the marriage doesn't necessarily change the character of it. Business interests, partnerships, distributions from corporation. It's going to be the date of those distributions. Partnership ownership interest is going to be the date that the partnership began. Real property is going to be the date the real property was acquired will be the date of inception. And then you have to look further to see how it was bought. Where did the funds come from for that? If you apply for a mortgage, you could have a mixed character in that house, or a claim for reimbursement if you use separate property funds to improve community property assets. Salary is a big one I get asked. So an interesting thing with salary is it's when it's earned. So not necessarily when it's paid. So that's important because obviously if we have a job before we're married, we're going to have funds that were earned prior to marriage that might have been paid after the marriage date. That does not become a community property income. However, you could have earned money during marriage that is actually paid after the divorce, and that money would actually still be community property. So it's kind of when that money was earned. Stock, you're going to look at when it was purchased, and any dividends or any payouts that you get are going to be the date that they were paid. So that's just a few assets that we usually look at. You know, retirement's another one. A lot of times we have a mixed retirement. If somebody was working and earning a retirement prior to marriage, we'd have to go in and determine which portion of that retirement account is community property and which is separate. So it's kind of a quick run through of inception of title, and like I said earlier, we'll talk about tracing and what that means. Tracing really becomes important when we have commingling of separate and community, and trying to find what property is separate and what property is community. But I just want to say thank you all for joining me this week, and hopefully you've gotten some good information out of this, and you can make some wiser decisions when it comes to divorce and protecting your assets. And I will be here next week, and we will talk about tracing next week. Anyway, everybody be safe. Looks like we have a once-in-a-lifetime event happening, not necessarily a good one. This week we actually have 2 hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico that are set to hit the Gulf Coast at the same time. One of them is heading straight for Houston right now, so everybody pay attention, be safe, and take care of yourself and your loved ones. We'll see you next week. And once again, anybody has questions, you can Facebook Messenger me. You can reach me by email at Duana, DUANA, at boswelltexaslaw.com. Or you can give us a call. We do have a free consultation, so there's no commitment on your part money-wise. And you can reach us and set up that appointment at 832-919-6595. Thanks, everyone, and have a great week.